And Sherwin joins us live now. Sherwin, so as cases surge and the various sporting codes start to plan to restart their much-delayed seasons, we still see this push-pull narrative from officials in the Trump administration. It must be having a negative impact on the numbers on the ground.
Yeah, and those numbers are very revealing, of course, Francis. More than 150,000 dead in the United States. You correctly point out 4.5 million cases soon to be reached in this country. And what you hear from the president is, yes, wear a mask, but, you know, if you can social distance, if you can't social distance, but let's reopen the states. And what you're seeing now in some of these hotspots around the country, and I'm not talking about New York or California, I'm talking about places you haven't perhaps heard in these conversations between us, Francis: Indiana, Kentucky, Tennessee. A lot of these middle rural states in the country are now seeing spikes in the number of new cases. And what Dr. Deborah Birx, the White House coronavirus task force coordinator, is telling these states is to close down, to shut the bars, to reduce indoor dining. So the mixed messaging here is also compounded by the fact that in some territories and regions of this country, testing is taking up to 2 weeks. People are waiting 2 weeks to get their test results, and that reduces the efficacy or the plausibility of what you are seeking to achieve through testing, which is to identify where the virus is and then contain the spread. So if you are asymptomatic and you go for a test and you're waiting 2 weeks to get those results, you might in those 2 weeks be spreading it to multiple numbers of people. And so that really is the big concern 6 months into this virus, that testing is not up to capacity in terms of what is required. And of course, as you correctly point out, the mixed messaging you are getting from officials in this Trump administration.
Yeah. So I remember him being very cross with the universities. I wonder if he's mad with Google, because Google's decision to allow its staff the option to work from home for the next year, making news yesterday, but not entirely unexpected, Sherwin, given the trajectory of this virus in the United States.
But a sobering assessment nonetheless. Some say an ominous warning of the trajectory of this virus, right? I mean, Google is telling its staff, 200,000 plus, that they don't have to come into the brick and mortar headquarters or regional offices they have around this country. But they're not the only one. Facebook is talking about the fact that 50% of all its staff, in 5 to 10 years, won't be required to come into the office at all. You were seeing companies like Nationwide, a big insurance company, closing down at least five of its brick and mortar locations, talking about how it's moving to a hybrid model. Twitter is also telling some of its workforce that they will not be required to come into any brick and mortar office for the future. So companies here are really reconfiguring what they're able to do under the current pandemic conditions, but what that tells us about how we can operate in the future, and what companies are going to have to do moving forward, whether you're talking about the SABC or otherwise, is really invest in upscaling the technology and the skills that their staff are able to, so that their staff are able to use these new platforms that really are providing a means for us to continue to deliver on the mandate and the requirements and the deadlines and so forth. So companies really have to look at how they are going to reconfigure how they operate, because this pandemic is teaching us many lessons that we need to move and take with us into the future.
Yeah, we're on a steep learning curve here, Sherwin. So let's look at Moderna. You said there in your insert, entering phase 3. So a lot of optimism, and this isn't the only company. We're involved in that trial that's linked to the UK. But tell us the downside before we get too optimistic here.
Yeah, words we've become familiar with, Francis: AstraZeneca and Moderna, right? So who's going to win the race here? Really positive sentiment that we're seeing here in terms of an effective, safe vaccine. Of course, the big concern is, given the breakneck speed at which we are moving towards an effective and safe vaccine, some concerns about whether safety protocols are being skirted around. And Dr. Fauci, the director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, saying that he is very confident, and various other public health officials that we have spoken to are very confident that the safety protocols are being adhered to. That being said, I think what countries need to start looking at now, public health officials, is really understanding the communication that needs to accompany bringing an effective vaccine to market. There are vaccine skeptics, you have anti-vax campaigners in the United States. If you look at the Ebola example in West Africa, there was a great deal of uncertainty from communities that were told, hey, this is how you need to deal with Ebola, this is how you need to deal with infected bodies from Ebola. There was a lot of pushback from those communities. And so the concern in the United States and elsewhere is that you won't get broad-based buy-in even when there is an effective vaccine. So it's important to send people out into those rural communities, have sit-downs with leaders of church communities, leaders of societies and so forth, people that are respected in communities that you need to bring on board as allies once and if and when an effective vaccine is available. So communication is going to be very important moving forward.
All right, so key. And then finally, before we let you go, Sherwin, shifting focus to the memorials for civil rights icon John Lewis this week. So we saw the social distancing, mask-wearing reception for the casket carrying his body at Capitol Hill in Washington yesterday. What can you tell us about that ceremony and what can we expect in the days ahead?
Well, he arrived in Washington from Troy, Alabama, his hometown, where there was a memorial held there. Of course, there was also his casket was drawn over the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama. Of course, the scene of the 1965 Voting Rights March, where he was beaten by state troopers that cracked his skull. Of course, arriving on that military aircraft in Washington, D.C., his home for over 30 years, where he represented the District of Atlanta, Georgia, in the United States Congress. His body, the casket received and afforded to lie in state at the Capitol Rotunda. But let's listen to what his siblings had to say at that Troy send-off in Alabama this weekend.
I remember the day when John left home. Mother told him not to get in trouble, not to get in the way, and be particular. But we all know that John got in trouble, got in the way, but it was a good trouble. John was different from the rest of the family, and he would have thoughts that all of the troubles he got himself into would change the world. I am so honored that John was my brother, and he will live forever in all our hearts. So keep John's legacy alive. Let's get out and vote. And in John's voice, keep your eyes on the prize.
He came from a humble beginning, always humble and respectful to others. So to my brother, Robert, this is not a goodbye. It's just a different kind of hello. And you know, when we talk, he always said, how are you doing? And he had this, I'm well. So rest well, Robert. Rest well.
His sister Ethel referring to John Robert Lewis, Robert, of course, his second name. And as that motorcade drove his casket to the Capitol Rotunda, Francis, yesterday, stopping along the way at various landmarks that would have been very, very important to John Lewis, including the Justice Department. This is a congressman that stood for justice as a national figure, the youngest speaker to speak at the March on Washington, when Martin Luther King Jr. gave that famous I Have a Dream speech, stopping at his memorial as well, the Lincoln Memorial, the African American Museum on its way to Capitol Hill. He will now, after Wednesday, be moved to the Georgia Legislative Rotunda, where he will again lie in state, of course, his hometown, ahead of his funeral on Thursday in Atlanta, Georgia.
All right, comprehensive update from the US as always. Thank you so much, SABC correspondent there, Sherwin Bryce-Pease.